Station identification.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
Operating frequency
on ztalkradio.com.
I am living on Channel Z.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
I am living on Channel Z.
Welcome to the Mind's Eye Show. I'm your host, Brian Turnov, and this is Z-Talk Radio. Our guest for this chapter of the Mind's Eye is Graham Nicholls, author, artist, and expert on out-of-body experiences, who has experienced and researched OBEs since 1987, as well as written 2 books on the subject. While he supports the existence of cyclical phenomena, he takes a scientific perspective towards the area. Graham has researched telepathy and taken part in precognition experiments with Rupert Sheldrake. He is a member of the Society for Cyclical Research, founded in London in 1882, and a partner member of the Institute for Noetic Sciences. He's lectured on topics such as spirituality, ethics, art, and parapsychology at venues such as Cambridge University, the Theosophical Society, and the Science Museum. The focus of our conversation will be his latest book, Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, Radical New Techniques. Drawing on more than 20 years of study and countless OBEs that he has brought about himself and others, Graham Nicholls shares proven techniques for leaving the body. You'll gain greater insight into your psychological makeup with a unique approach to self-discovery, and learn to use your greater awareness to project into the astral plane with an out-of-body experience. You're in for a hell of a ride tonight. The Mind's Eye Show will be right back in just a few short moments with out-of-body experience expert Graham Nicholls.
Nurse, set up an IV. And you, her boyfriend, you were the driver?
Yes, doctor, but I didn't mean to hurt her. I only had a few drinks. I was just buzzed.
Just buzzed? Oh, then your girlfriend is fine.
Hey, sweetie. I feel great.
She's really okay?
What, are you kidding? No, not really. Nurse, get me a suture kit. Stat.
Buzzed driving. Maybe we should stop acting like it's no big deal. Buzzed driving is drunk driving. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Ad Council.
Hi, this is Paul McCartney on behalf of RAD. If you're drinking, you can't drive my car or any car. And remember, don't drink and drive. It's just not worth it.
But you can do something in between. Maybe you can drive my car.
A public service announcement brought to you by the U.S. Department of Transportation, RAD, the National Association of Broadcasters, and the Ad Council.
I am living on Channel Z.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
I am living on Channel Z.
The views expressed and opinions given by the individual hosts and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Z-Talk Radio, its affiliates, or sponsors.
We're back and joined by author, artist, and OBE expert Graham Nicholls to discuss his latest, Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, Radical New Ideas. Thanks for coming on the Mind's Eye tonight.
You're welcome.
For our listeners who may not be familiar with the topic, please give a quick overview of out-of-body experiences and astral projection.
Well, outer body experiences, in my understanding, are an experience of the self, the essential core understanding of who we are, being separated from our physical body and being at another location. The physical body actually becomes less important in these kinds of experiences, and we often talk in terms of an outer body experience, but in many ways it's more like a primary experience of the self being located somewhere else and liberated from physical restraints. So that's kind of how I see it.
And this isn't exactly a new concept. It has a long history extending back to ancient times and ancient religions too, I believe.
It does, yeah. It goes. The ancient Egyptians used to talk about the ka, for example. They had two ideas. They had the ba and the ka, and the ka was essentially like the second body, the astral body, whatever terminology you want to use. So it does seem that it's a very, very old concept. There's descriptions also in Hinduism and different cultures across the world.
And you've had hundreds of out-of-body experiences since you were a young age. Do you mind sharing what your first OBE experience was like and how it changed your perspective?
My very first experiences were very short. They were spontaneous and essentially involved finding myself completely away from my physical body. So this kind of goes back to my definition that I just mentioned. I wasn't aware of my body at all. I was at another location, and it was like I was floating maybe 2 feet off the ground, so in a vertical position, not horizontal as many people describe. And I was just floating there, aware of the environment around me, and almost as soon as the experience had begun, it then ended and I found myself back in my body. But it was enough to spark my interest, obviously, and around 6-7 months later I found out about the idea of astral projection or out-of-body experiences, and I got a book on the subject by a parapsychologist called Janet Lee Mitchell, and I basically read that, became convinced that these were important experiences, and I decided to try and induce one intentionally. And I spent the next 6 months every single night trying to induce the experience. It took me 6 months. I wasn't able to do it very quickly, but I stuck with it, and then at a certain point, almost when I was at the point of giving up, I relaxed and sort of let go to the experience, and then I had my first induced OBE and found myself looking down at my body in a much more classic out-of-body experience that you hear in descriptions of cardiac arrest and medical type scenarios. I was above my body looking straight down, maybe around 2 feet from the ceiling, so you can get an idea of the height. and I had a kind of sensation almost like there was a pole running through my body, so I could rotate side to side, but I couldn't lift myself upright. So every time I tried to move at all, go around the room or anything like that, I would just rotate on this axis. And that basically lasted for a couple of minutes. I'm not exactly sure how long. And then I came back to my body, just felt myself kind of phase back into my physical body. But it was then like the floodgates had opened, and I was able to have out-of-body experiences in a much more fluid way from that point on.
And how did it change your perspective? As a young age, that must have been pretty jarring, cognitively at least.
In some ways, I think because I was quite young, I accepted it in many ways, maybe more than I would have done if it had happened later in life. I think because I had other experiences, not out-of-body experiences, but I'd seen an apparition, for example, when I was around 5 or 6 years old. So these kinds of things were not common in my life, but they were familiar to me. They weren't alien. So I didn't have a lot of the fears that people often describe. I was more excited and wanted to explore and wanted to find out more of what was going on. So that was really my attitude at the time. I guess I had a certain degree of apprehension about moving too far from where my body was and moving out of the house and things like that. That was initially maybe my fears, but I didn't have any major issues about the actual experience. And I guess at the beginning I also wasn't totally convinced whether it was real or whether it was some kind of unusual hallucination, or I didn't really know. It wasn't until a little while later that I had my first experience that I was able to verify, where I went to a street in London called Lancaster Road that I'd never actually been to physically. And I went into the first floor of a terraced house there and was able to read the name of the person who lived there on some letterhead paper. This is pre-internet. And then I also was able to see the postcode on the wall in the street, which is characteristic in London. There's these it was West 11. There's all these different area codes that you see all around London, and I was able to see that. But interestingly, I couldn't see the whole sign, just that part of it, which kind of relates to theories about how I think we see in these states.
Once you started realizing, obviously, after verifying that this is definitely real, it's not a hallucinogen or it's not a dream in any sense, you probably wanted to understand it even more, like you said earlier. Talk about some of the supporting scientific evidence that you found for out-of-body experiences.
Oh, okay. Well, unfortunately, there hasn't been that much actual research on the experience without assuming that it's not real. I mean, there's a lot of studies going on. Olaf Blank, for example, is a famous one. He's done lots of research that's got huge amounts of press worldwide. But he comes from the assumption that the experience isn't real and it's just a kind of bodily illusion, which doesn't add up when you apply that to the kind of experiences I've had. When you're talking about moving over vast distances, seeing complex environments and seeing things objectively, I don't think saying it's a bodily illusion really stacks up. But really, since the 60s, there hasn't been that much done in the way of research. Charles Tart did the famous case with Miss Z, or Miss Z as you would probably say, and in that study, this woman was able to perceive a 5-digit number that was hidden on a platform high up in the room that they were doing the experiment in, while she was rigged up to a monitoring system. So there's a lot of skepticism around that case and whether it was actually solid enough and controlled enough, but Charles Tart still stands by it and feels that because she was rigged up to the technology, she couldn't really have cheated, and so that's a very interesting case. But he never followed that up and continued and did more research in that area, and since then there hasn't really been that much. So the main research has been in the area of near-death experiences. So there's some very good studies, like Penny Sartori's in the UK. She had a case, patient 10 she calls it, in which a man was able to witness various details about what was happening to him while he was in a coma, or at least unconscious. Actually, I'm not sure it was a coma, but anyway, he was able to perceive lots of details that he couldn't have seen while he was deeply unconscious and being monitored by the medical staff. And then in Pim van Lommel's research, which is the biggest study ever conducted, he did 20 years of research in Holland, and he found some excellent cases as well. The most famous one in that is a 44-year-old man who had his dentures removed after he had his cardiac arrest, and he was able to describe the nurse who removed the dentures and describe the entire scene after his cardiac arrest once the dentures had been removed, and he even knew where they'd been put, etc. So there's lots of cases within prospective studies, which means a study that they intentionally went out looking for these kinds of experiences. So I think in near-death research there's some really strong evidence.
Yeah, that last case that you just mentioned sounds similar to one that I've actually been following. I'm based out of Long Island, New York, and someone that I think you're familiar with has been working on this one, Dr. Peter Fenwick. He's been working on the AWARE study. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, Peter Fenwick and the AWARE study is interesting, but my personal take is because of the way I feel that vision works in the out-of-body experience, and I think Pim van Lommel, for example, agrees with me on this. We both don't feel that the sign protocol, actually having signs over the bed, etc., is really the best way to approach things because, well, I mean, I once used the example in a lecture. I asked everyone in the lecture hall what picture was on the back of the lecture hall. They'd all walked past it as they were walking into the hall, and I asked them without looking round if any of them could remember what it was. A famous painting. 2 people out of around 100 were able to remember what the image was. So I think the whole idea that if you were having an out-of-body experience and your body was dying and there were doctors, etc., operating on you, why you would pay attention to a sign above the bed. And from what I've heard as well, they're using things like newspaper cuttings as the targets, and I just don't really see why someone would pay attention to that. But that's just my personal feelings on the AWARE study. But I think a lot of what Peter Fenwick has done in the past has been really excellent research.
If someone gave you the keys to a scientific study, how would you design one? What do you think would be the perfect way to prove OBEs?
I think I would look very closely at the type of vision and the type of perceptions that people have, because I think one of the problems is there's just an assumption that the vision is exactly the same and operates in exactly the same way as physical vision. To me, that makes no sense because we're not using physical eyes, so there aren't retinas with photons hitting receptors, etc., as would happen with physical vision. So I think that either the brain is replicating vision based on some other kind of information that's coming into it, or there's a different kind of visual process going on. So I'm interested in what that is, and so I've looked through a lot of my diaries. I've kept diaries since 1990 of my experiences, so I've got a lot of data that describes how I see colours, textures, all of these kinds of things, and I found that there's maybe 4 different ways that are key, and I've given them all kind of names, and they seem to relate to the electromagnetic spectrum, the light spectrum, the visible light spectrum. So I think that's a clue to what could be going on in terms of how we see in an out-of-body experience. And also I found that there's this kind of zoom effect, a sort of highly detailed central area to the vision, but the outer areas can be less focused or less clear. And I think that's why in the experience that I described earlier, where the first time I was able to verify one of my experiences, I only saw the postcode portion of the sign. I didn't see the whole sign with the name of the street. And I think that was because the vision works with this kind of central focus, or at least maybe some kind of zoom effect. So when we start to pay attention to how people like me see when we're having these experiences, I think we'll get a better idea of how to work with these kinds of things. Another thing I've identified is generally it's far more common that people see small 3-dimensional objects than they see flat images. If you think about all of the famous cases, Pam Reynolds, she saw a small drill being used on her head. There's the famous tennis shoe case. A blue tennis shoe was seen on a ledge outside of the hospital. There's the denture case that I've already mentioned. Nearly all of the famous cases involve a small object that's under 10 inches square. And I think that's quite interesting in itself.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating component of that. I've never actually heard that particular characteristic. That's really interesting.
Well, no one, as far as I'm aware, has identified it other than me. It's something that I've noticed, and it goes along with this kind of zoom effect that I'm describing. So I think that these are the things we need to do. We need to pay real close attention to how these experiences happen and what people see when they have them, and then maybe we'll get a better idea of how to verify them and what kind of things to use. So straight away that would suggest to me, let's use a small three-dimensional object, not a flat image, etc.
Fascinating. Well, I hope somebody gives you the keys to it, because that would definitely be some interesting aspects to look into. In your book, Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, you talked about the extended mind theory and quantum entanglement theory. I'm a layman. You mind going into that a little bit more in its relationship?
Okay, well, most of the theories out there about this gets into the broader area of psychic abilities, but I don't really divide them all up. I think that an out-of-body experience is just a fully separated experience of your psychic faculties, if you like, whereas telepathy or something is just one aspect of that bigger whole. So virtually all of the theories out there draw upon quantum effects in some way, and this is not my theory, and this is not coming from non-scientists.
Right.
This is people like Brian Josephson, who won the Nobel Prize for physics. He actually has an effect called the Josephson effect named after him. So, this is a guy who fully understands the implications of quantum physics.
Yeah, he's got the cred.
So when the skeptics kind of dismiss whenever you talk about anything quantum, it's not me talking about it, I'm just referencing these scientists who talk about this. So he puts forward a theory called biological utilization of quantum non-locality, which broken down, it basically means that biological aspects of the brain, so normal functions of the brain, are utilizing these quantum extended effects, so non-locality. Non-locality is basically, you can take two particles, so a photon, for example, which is a particle of light. You can separate those particles over any distance whatsoever as far as the physics is concerned, and you affect particle A, and particle B will instantaneously be affected in the same way. So it's essentially like they're the same particle, but existing in two places at the same time. Now, this is completely mainstream physics. This isn't anything controversial. But what people like Josephson are suggesting is that maybe these effects are part of the brain, part of functions in the brain, and that maybe psychic abilities are utilizing these kinds of quantum effects, and that's how information is traveling or moving over a distance. And he's put together his theory of it. There's also Roger Penrose, another very well-respected physicist, who believes that the microtubules, the very, very low levels of the brain, very, very small factors, are being affected by quantum effects in a similar way to I just described with Josephson, but he's nailed it down to this specific area that he thinks is key. So in his theory, those areas of the brain give rise to consciousness, and because those areas are susceptible to these quantum effects like entanglement, non-locality, essentially he thinks that's how a near-death experience could happen, or consciousness could be separate from the brain. So essentially data or information could be coming from outside and arising into the brain. So this starts to move into ideas like whether maybe we could be dealing with the brain more like a receiver than a creator of consciousness, because for a long time they've been trying to find the answer to how consciousness arises in the brain, but there's no there's no reliable way to answer that question. It's called the hard problem of consciousness, because we don't yet know how that could happen from a biological robot, which is the line on what a human is, essentially, if you take the reductionist idea.
Well, I tend not to take that one. I like to hope we're a little bit more than that, but I like the receiver idea. That's a really interesting concept, and I think that seems to be gaining some steam recently as well. Before, you mentioned you've had a few different types of out-of-body experiences. One is sounded like it was in space. The other one you mentioned was a precognitive one. How many different types of ones have you had, or have you been able to look in those type of characteristics? How many different types of OBE experiences there really are?
Well, I guess there's the location factor. Obviously, I mean the out-of-body experiences that were in space are not necessarily any different in terms of characteristics to one that happens on the Earth or in my local environment. It's just that it happened in a different location. The experiences don't seem to be very limited by distance. I've not been extremely far into space in these experiences, so I guess they might be limited by some distance, but I don't know the answer to that at this point, but they definitely allow you to go into the local solar system, at least in terms of the perceptions that you can have. The different states have been characterized more by the colors, the way that I've seen things. The two most interesting ones in terms of this reality, this sort of physical world that we're familiar with, is I call one the crystalline state and one the cerulean state. The crystalline state is characterized by it looks crystalline. It's infused with kind of like a sunlight, kind of yellow, vivid light kind of feeling, almost like there's energy behind everything. When I have that kind of experience, it's often verifiable. It's often quite an objective experience. Recent ones that have happened around Tallinn in Estonia, where I currently live, experiences around that area that I've been able to verify and had witnesses to have happened via that crystalline state. Then I've also had these cerulean experiences. I've only actually had 3 of these in my whole life. 2 of them were precognitive, and the other one was the verified experience I mentioned, the very first one I ever had. So these 3 experiences all had a bluish grey quality to them, and the last 2 were precognitive. The most significant was the first precognitive one. I was in a small workshop with 4 other people, and I was teaching the G technique, which is one of the methods I use for inducing OBEs. And it was actually the first time I'd ever taught it, and I started to feel like it wasn't really working, nothing was happening. And then suddenly, just as I was thinking that, I was overwhelmed by this kind of heightened energy. And then I just went straight down onto the ground, and it was almost like a quite high velocity. I started moving through this jungle-like environment, and there was a stream, and it just looked very kind of tropical, I guess. And I was moving through that environment, and then after a couple of minutes, that seemed to break, and then I was just standing on the corner of Moore Street and Old Compton Street in central London, which kind of juts out like a point. The 2 streets form this very acute point that points directly down Old Compton Street, which is the central street of Soho in London. And this explosion just burst out around 150 meters away, something like that, on the right-hand side. And I saw a man run close by me. I looked to my right and I recognized the Polo Bar, which is a Italian restaurant that was there. And so I knew exactly where I was. And then I felt this huge kind of emotional wave that seemed to come from the explosion, which felt like it hit me physically. in that experience. And then the next thing I knew, I was back in my body, but I wasn't able to just get up and carry on. I felt like I was in a kind of void, or some in-between kind of liminal state between being conscious and unconscious. And one of the other people there, a guy called Chris, started to bring me out of this state. He started to just sort of coax me out and speak to me as I was, because obviously people there could tell that something was going on.
Yeah, I'm sure they were probably pretty worried, I would imagine.
Possibly, yeah. And I slowly came out of this state, and then we made a circle in the middle of the room. We were in this big space, and I described that I'd seen this bombing, and that I believed that it was a precognitive experience. I'd never given any kind of precognitive information before. I didn't even particularly believe in such things, but it felt so strong that that's what it was, that I felt that I really should share that and say that's what I felt it was. So I described it to everyone, and several people went off and wrote down what I'd said, and I did the same thing within a couple of hours. And then 5 days later, there was a bombing on that street in that location, exactly as I described it in the out-body experience. So that, on multiple levels, was one of the most powerful experiences, because it was witnessed, because it was so powerful emotionally, psychologically, on many levels. So
would you look at that as a gift and a curse? Because I don't know if I'd really want to have that experience and know that, quite frankly. And because really there's nothing you probably could have done about it. Really, definitely there's nothing you could have done about it. I imagine you look at this as more as a gift, even though I know you can induce it yourself and you have your methods, which we'll talk about. But at that time, I would imagine that must have been like a little bit of a curse at the moment.
I wouldn't say I saw it as a curse. I just saw it as an experience among the many experiences that I can have in this kind of work. I mean, I've only had 2 experiences like that in my whole life. So if you think about the hundreds and hundreds of positive, amazing, beautiful, transcendent experiences, having 2 experiences like that just in a way give a deeper context to the whole thing, and they do suggest that maybe if not change what was going to happen, at least be aware of it and possibly avoid it to some degree. Maybe avoid being there yourself physically. I mean, I was supposed to be on that street on that day, and it turned out that I just unconsciously decided not to go. And that, after having that experience, it wasn't a conscious thing, like I've had that experience, so I'm not going to go anywhere near Soho. But just on that day, I just felt, I don't think I'm going to go today.
Yeah, you're gonna avoid it for at least a few days, to say the least.
Yeah.
And it sounds, you're talking about precog. I want to talk a little bit more about your experiences, then we'll talk about the methods. On the opposite end of the spectrum, have you ever maybe gone back in time?
I've had one experience that stands out on that level. It wasn't intentional. Again, most of the really profound experiences tend to just unfold. They don't tend to be ones that I've decided to go to a particular place or a particular time or anything like that. I think with a lot of things in life, the moments when everything is in sync and everything works tends to be, quite random and just to do with how you are on that day or something like that, being in the zone, I guess. But on this particular day, I was living in a tower block in central London, just off the Edgware Road, which is a big main road, Roman road. And I came out of the 4th floor window and moved into Edgware Road. But Edgware Road was still there, but it was completely different. Suddenly it was a scene from, I would guess, Victorian London. It looked, everything was suddenly much smaller. the scene behind me where I'd just come from, which was in current times heavily built and full of tall buildings and many different things. When I looked back, it was fields basically. It was just open areas. There was no heavy buildings or even anything on the other side of the main road. And then I started to move along the street, and I saw people with carts, like horses and carts, which were also heavily painted in bright colours, which slightly jarred my preconceptions about Victorian London. I guess I always tend to think of it all as black and white, etc. I guess we all do to some degree, but it was actually, their carts were very colourful, and they were dressed in quite colourful ways, and they were moving along the main road. And then there were people who seemed more like the middle classes, who were dressed in maybe the more stereotypical way that we think of Victorian people. Smart suits and things like that. But yeah, so I moved along the street and I could recognise some of it, but a lot of it was very different as well. So I maybe reached about the halfway point down the street, and then came back to my body. The experience just kind of dissolved away.
Fascinating. And for those just joining us on The Mind's Eye, we're talking with Graham Nicholls about his latest Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, Radical New Ideas. And by now, I'm sure listeners like me are thinking already, all right, I want to know how to do this by myself. So let's talk about some of the methods that you've developed to help induce OBEs. And as we know, people learn in different ways, and it sounds like everyone at least has this ability to do so. How would you recommend someone starting?
I think that the starting point is to really look at yourself, and as I describe in the book, there's a part which is based on this idea of creating a profile. The reason for that is because very early with my teaching, I realized that, for example, someone will come to me to learn, and they might know a particular technique, for example, like the body of light technique, visualizing a figure standing at the foot of their bed and trying to project their consciousness into it, which they've read that they should do as they're going to sleep. But then they'll say to me, oh, but I always fall asleep when I do that. And I'll ask them, well, what kind of person are you? Are you more of an evening person, or are you more of an optimal person? Are you better in the early morning? And usually they'll say, I'm more of an early morning person. So straight away I'll know that probably they should work with techniques that they do upon waking up in the hypnopompic state, as we call it, the point when you're waking up from sleep, rather than the point going into sleep, which is called the hypnagogic state. So just simple things like this, by looking at the individual and really working with who they are, that way you can get a much better understanding of the types of approaches that will work. I look at things in a much bigger sense than just looking at it in terms of techniques. Most people just want to find the ultimate technique, but the truth is there's no one technique that will be perfect for everyone. You have to match the technique to the individual, not the individual to the technique, which is what most people try to do.
And that's the correct way of teaching, of course. That's definitely the proper way. But I know you've developed at least a few techniques to help that. Something called the G technique, which you talked about earlier, and I believe something else called a three-dimensional system. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the G technique was because I'm quite physical. I like more physical kinds of techniques. I started to think about how could I create the right kind of physical state for inducing the vibrations. The vibrations are the common precursor to the out-of-body experience. Lots of people have them. Not everyone. I don't want to give the impression that everyone has to have vibrations, but they're quite common. Maybe 50 or 60% of people will have some kind of vibration or electrical sensation, something like that, prior to the OBE. And I realized in my own work that if I could get to the vibrational state, then I could easily get to the out-of-body state. So my focus became the first step, getting to the vibrations. So the G technique was my first idea to work with that, because I started to think about, well, how can we get to that, the classic thing, mind awake, body asleep kind of state that we hear a lot about. Robert Monroe coined that many years ago. So I started to realize that if I can create this kind of balance between the body and mind by using physical tension and also breathing techniques, by combining the two things, I could essentially create the right state for the out-of-body experience. So that's kind of how the G technique developed. It's not really a technique, actually. There are several versions of it. It's more of a G system, I should probably call it.
That's the umbrella name for it. We'll call it.
Yeah, it's there are G techniques, but they're all based on this same kind of principle of creating the mind awake, body asleep duality kind of state, and that's really the key to OBEs. And I think all of the techniques work on creating that, then followed by this idea of moving or transferring awareness to somewhere else. So if you can get those three factors together, then that's when the experience happens. So again, I tend to teach in a way where I try to say, learn to understand the process, and then it's no longer about techniques. It's about responding to the situation. If you know how the system works, or how the process works of having an out-of-body experience, then you can just respond to it in a natural way, and you don't have to say, oh, but this doesn't fit with this particular technique that I've learned, or whatever. So that's kind of how, especially when I work one-on-one with people, I also do that. It's my favorite way of working, is to do coaching with people via Skype. So I do that, and because I'm working one-on-one, I can really go into the details of that individual and give them what they need to know to have the experience, and hopefully develop their own methods, their own techniques as well, once they fully understand the approach.
Once you get to that point, is it like riding a bicycle where you just you jump on and you know exactly how to induce it? Is that the point that you're trying to get each person to?
Yeah, I would say it's more analogous to something like creativity. If you ever think about, I don't know if you do anything creative like painting or writing or anything like that, but if you've ever been in that situation where on a particular day you just feel in the zone and you're just like, yes, I just want to be creative today, and another day you just feel flat and you just, no matter what you do, you can't be creative. I think we've all had that to some degree, and I think that's similar with the OBE. So the way I try to do it is to create the conditions in your life. So not just within the technique, but within your wider life. Let's look at how much stress, how much time, all these different factors, by creating the right conditions for the OBE. So you're in the right mental state, the right physical state, all of those things. Then when you lay down to actually do that particular process, that particular technique, your chances of being successful are hugely increased. If you ignore all of that stuff, then you're diminishing your chances overall. And I think that's why people who are very obsessed with just doing the technique and not looking at their life in general, that's why they don't get very far.
And talking about the conditions, for me, example, I would tell you I'm a need to be in control type of guy. To be able to get into that state of mind, or I guess outside of our regular state of mind, do I need to be in complete self-control, or is it one of those times where I have to let go of all inhibitions, so to speak?
It's a bit of a combination of both, I'd say. There's a degree of control needed, but that's more of a sort of mental focus, maybe something akin to meditation, but it's not quite the same. and also having the ability to let go to the experience, to allow the experience to happen, because some people tense up because of fears or tensions or phobias, etc. So they'll just react with tension, and you need to be able to react with letting go, going with the experience. So if you can create the focus and the letting go at the same time, that's
a best of both worlds, so to speak, I guess.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to pull off, but that's the key, really.
Well, I'm sure everybody who's listening is hoping that they're going to be able to, and let's say that they do get to that point, and what can they physically and I guess mentally, for lack of a better word, to expect while they're on the astral plane for really the beginner?
Well, I guess again it's slightly different for different people. I don't really want to impose too much of that onto people, because I think they should just explore and see what's out there. Because I think some of the problems historically with this kind of work is people say, oh yes, there's this amount of astral planes, this works like this, there's an astral body that looks like this and does this and has a silver cord, etc., etc., etc. And that actually holds people back, because often they come to me and they say, oh, but I was told this, this and this, and then they find it hard to let go and actually learn something new. And you know, they might be worried that they're going to break the silver cord. I've never even seen a silver cord. But
I was going to ask you about that. That's something that was brought up. I know you don't want to put a limiting idea in people's minds, but and it's funny that you brought that up. I never really understood what that is, and it's interesting that I guess you said you never had that type of experience.
No, and in the hundreds of people I've worked with, I virtually never hear anyone describe it either. The only people who ever describe it are people who maybe have that as a strong part of their belief system. I've never seen any real strong evidence that such a thing exists. I think it's a leftover from a kind of more esoteric way of viewing things. I did quite a lot of research with the second book into whether there was any solid, even historical precedent for that idea. And a lot of people say, for example, it's in the Bible, for example. But then when I actually looked up the specific reference, it says something about broking the silver chain and cracking the golden goblet, or something
like a telephone
like that.
game.
So it's you know, I mean, it could be anything. It could be referring to anything. So I don't really put much weight on that idea. But because I try to look at things more in a scientific way and say, what do we have evidence for? I think that really frees us up, and then we don't have to buy into any particular belief system. I think, you know, you don't need one. Learn to have the experience, find out what's there for yourself, and, you know, forget about what people believe is out there. Find out for yourself what's out there. That's my attitude about the whole thing.
I think that's just how life should be. Just grab it by the throat for yourself and really experience it all for yourself. And you said the precognitive dream was, I guess it wasn't really a bad experience, but have you had any of those that you would define as bad, I guess, for lack of better word? A negative experience, maybe something that really just it haunts you to this day in an aspect, in a negative way, maybe.
To be honest, no.
Oh, good.
And I don't even those precognitive experiences I don't even see as negative, because they had a hugely positive effect on me. They opened me up to not seeing time and space in such a limited way. Kind of got me interested in quantum physics, in fact, things like that, because how could this be the case? I spoke to Dean Radin, the researcher into psychic abilities, about this, and he was saying, well, in a quantum sense, there is no time, linear time in that sense. So when you start to think in those ways, it could have been a potentiality, it could have been many things, but it really opened me up. And and then it also made me think more about violence and why people behave in that kind of way, and actually sort of led me more towards exploring non-violence and some of the philosophies like that from people like Gandhi and these different philosophers. So it really opened me up in a positive way, and yeah, generally in the experiences, I can't really think of anything that I would actually call negative at all. So and I don't really hear any cases of that either, really.
Okay, good. Well, I'm sure that probably relieves some of the stress in our listeners' minds a little bit. At least it does for me, to say the least. But if the consciousness can exist outside the body, and if this is true and the law of conservation of energy is true, then I guess it's possible we can exist after physical death. Do you think the astral plane is where we go after we die, or do you have maybe another opinion on what happens after we die with our consciousness?
We seem to go somewhere.
I sure hope so, at least, because it's depressing otherwise.
But what exactly that is, because you see, when you use terms like the astral plane, I'm not really sure what that is exactly and what that means. It's a classic term,
right?
But it doesn't really tell us where or what it is. It's just there are different levels of reality. Well, I guess we can agree on that to some degree. But I guess I see it more like a larger consciousness system. I don't know if you know Tom Campbell's or the ideas, or the listeners know Tom Campbell's ideas, and also people like Anthony Peake, who's a friend of mine and an excellent writer. I think these people are putting out different models that kind of include these quantum ideas, but also maybe bring in some of the more classical ideas as well. It's kind of bringing it full circle, and I like the idea that it's almost like a cosmic consciousness or a larger consciousness that possibly we're connecting with that, and many of my experiences have resonated with that in a literal way. For example, I had an experience of a kind of universal mind where I was interconnected with this, almost like a fountain of awareness, of consciousness. It actually looked very much like the painting The Universal Mind Lattice by Alex Gray. If anyone wants to look that up, that's very much what this experience looked like. But in this particular experience, it was like I'd gone into this huge consciousness and was every awareness all at once. It was a completely incredible and mind-blowing experience. I describe it in my first book, Avenues of the Human Spirit, and it just changed everything. It made me look at the world as being completely interconnected and completely one, essentially, and that was, that really did change everything for me.
It sounds absolutely beautiful, and after reading your book, I'm hoping to be able to maybe get to that point, hopefully, because it sounds like a wonderful experience. And I know I only have you for a few more minutes, and you're doing a bit of traveling coming up, and I believe you also might be coming to my area in the United States. Tell me about what you're up to in the short future, and where someone maybe can catch you in person to hear about OBEs.
Well, yeah, next month I'm going to be in Las Vegas speaking at the International Remote Viewing Association conference. So that's going to be an amazing event. Eben Alexander is speaking, Russell Targ, the original scientist behind remote viewing, is going to be speaking. So there's some really great people on the bill for that. So that I'm going to be speaking there about the crossover between remote viewing and out of body experiences, because I remote view, but I combine elements of the out of body experience with the remote viewing protocols. So I'm trying to essentially develop something that has the accuracy that can be present in the outer body experiences, like what I've described in the precognitive experiences, for example, that veridical, accurate, objective side of things, with the controllability of remote viewing, that you can control it. It seems more than with the outer body experience. So if we could find a kind of middle ground, that way I think all of them can be optimized. And I use technology and different things to do that. I've been working with immersive technology since the late 90s, and I've built structures that help to induce altered states and out of body experiences. I've worked with virtual reality and things like that, sound technology, basically all of the senses. I like the idea of immersion, using all of the senses, and also limiting the senses, so sensory deprivation and things like that. Listeners might have come across flotation tanks and things of that nature.
And you've done some art installations that combine the two, right? Out-of-body experiences. From an early one, I believe you had one, an art installation that related the two.
Yeah, I made them in the context of art galleries and museums, like the Science Museum in London. So they were designed to be fun for people to experience, but they also had a deeper meaning of they could introduce people to a different state of being that they might not have thought about before. So the first one was called Epicene, and was built in 1998, and had the first version of my infraliminal sound technology, which is designed to induce the vibrational state. So it was a kind of early experimental piece going along those lines, and then I've continued to develop that, and then also moved into virtual reality in the 2000s, and the largest piece was a very large scale virtual reality installation at the Science Museum that was completely interactive, completely 3D stereoscopic, like you see in movies like Avatar, etc. But this was, quite a while before that kind of technology was generally seen. So
yeah, I would have loved to have seen the faces of the people after experiencing those, particularly the Epicene one. That sounds very fascinating. I would have loved to see the faces of people coming after that altered state of mind. And clearly you're a Renaissance man, but you're also an author. What do you have any ideas for your next book rattling around in your brain?
I have a few book projects in the in the pipeline. I'm working on one that maybe goes a bit further with the whole exploring the ideas around consciousness, and I'm also doing some research that relates more to like life after death and some of those ideas. So I've got a few things I'm working on and researching.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely keep our eye out there. And before we let you go, just give out your social media sites so for our listeners, so they can reach out to you.
Okay, well, my main website is grahamnicholls.com. That's Nicholls with 2 L's. And you can also add me on Facebook, and I'm also on Twitter at Graham_Nicholls with 2 L's again.
Excellent. Graham Nicholls, author, artist, OBE expert, thank you so much for your time and sharing about your latest Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, Radical New Ideas.
You're very welcome.
I hope you enjoyed this uplifting edition of The Mind's Eye Show with guest and out-of-body experience expert Graham Nicholls about his latest Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, Radical New Techniques. So I'm going on a road trip across America for research on an upcoming book, and I'm taking a 6-week summer vacation, so the Mind's Eye Show will be on hiatus. I've already made stops in Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and across my home base of New York. Trip moves onwards to Massachusetts, Ohio, and Michigan. I'll tell you all about it on the Mind's Eye Show when we return around Labor Day. In the meantime, engage your brain with cherry-picked news articles, see the upcoming guest schedule, view mind-blowing videos, and more, all at themindseyemedia.com. Of course, the show would be nothing without you, Thanks so much for your listenership. I'm Brian Turnov, signing off on another The Mind's Eye Show for Z Talk Radio.